think we're going to... Goodness. Okay. We're a little short today, but that's okay. People may show up. I don't know if there's traffic or weather or something.
We didn't run through rain, but that looked like it had rain.
Yeah, well, there was,
Some schools getting out.
yeah, traffic, yeah. Who knows, indeed. Let's see here, where are we? We're going to keep it short today because I decided I'd actually try to keep it to the time limit. I'm going to ease myself back into things and not try to keep you for an extra hour and a half or something. Let's pray. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who lovest mankind with the pure light of thy divine knowledge. Open the eyes of our mind to the understanding of thy gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well-pleasing unto thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and unto thee we ascribe glory together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy, good, and life-creating Spirit, now and ever unto ages of ages. Amen. Let's see here. So we are, of course, it wouldn't be a class on the Book of Common Prayer if I didn't forget my own Book of Common Prayer. So, goodness. We're finished with ordinations. I was looking, and it's been just over a month since last we met. We pretty much took all of August off. And that was to do partly with the air conditioning, partly because I was away a little bit, and all the rest of it, and then partly because I was away a little bit and needed to ease back into things because everything was so busy right when I got back.
August was a weird month.
It was. So, at any rate, we had just finished with the ordinations. We did 2 weeks on ordinations, and today we're going to begin with the next section of the Episcopal Services, which begins right before it begins on page 557. And this is the beginning for the service of a celebration of new ministry. The service, just brief historical background, the service of celebration of new ministry developed sort of over the medieval period when more and more men were being ordained for the priesthood without parishes for them to serve in as rectors. It used to be that you would just get ordained as a priest in the parish where you were being called to serve, so there was no need to sort of have a distinctive service wherein that person would become the rector of the parish, or whatever the term was that was used, simply because the ordination was sufficient for that. It was a sufficient celebration that this person was coming among you as one who was called to serve and lead liturgically, sacramentally, pastorally. But then over time, you get all these people being ordained as assistants and so on and so forth, with the idea that eventually they might be able to get their own parish once they've been more seasoned. And then suddenly it became a question of, well, how do we show that they have been given authority here? And that's the genesis of the service of a celebration of new ministry. And we'll talk more about a related element of that, which is to say the planting of new churches, which would be the next section on the consecration of a church or chapel. But we'll talk about that the next time we gather to do this. On page 557, we begin with the letter of institution. This is basically this is not a liturgy. This is a rubrical guide on how a bishop is to formulate the legal document that empowers a cleric to function within their office. This is historically what you were required to provide, and this is not quite a contract. It is more like a royal proclamation coming from the bishop, proclaiming that his authority as bishop has been imparted to so-and-so to serve in such and such a place, in such and such an office, for such and such purposes. And one of the connections that you'll notice there is actually if you read let me see, did I write any notes down? In the third paragraph, there is an emphasis here on in communion with your bishop. That's an interesting point, and it's one of the things that we'll see throughout this section that I wanted to emphasize is this idea of relationship with your bishop. Why is that important? Well, how was I selected to be the rector of this parish? There was a search committee which was composed of lay members of this parish who considered multiple candidates and then sent a call to me. But then the bishop, actually the anniversary of that is coming up quick at the end of this month. It'll be the 4th anniversary of my installation as the rector of this parish. I was licensed by the bishop to serve here. It is in cooperation. We aren't a congregational polity. If you go back to our previous lessons, if you remember, the word polity means our manner of governing the church. We aren't congregational. It's not St. Thomas can do whatever the heck it wants, St. Edward's does whatever it wants, and there is no formal governance structure above that. No, we are all under the bishop. And so the letter was a mechanism whereby the bishop's authority was imparted to the priest to serve in the parish. And that emphasis there, in communion with your bishop, was a reminder to the laity of the parish that just because you had a search committee and called this person to be your priest, or if you're the patron of the parish and you're granting the benefice to a particular priest, this is to do with, in the UK, with a lot of parishes, wealthy patrons would provide money for the parish as a part of what wealthy people, nobles, gentry did in that time. They would provide for the church just as people provided for other community services. So they had some level of direct control over the priests that would go there, in the sense that they controlled the money. So this is, interestingly enough, not unlike the challenges between the kings and parliaments that you see historically throughout all sorts of different countries. But the emphasis here on in communion with your bishop was a reminder from the bishop that he was the one in charge and he was the one licensing the priest to function. It wasn't just a function of the laity to call a particular priest to do whatever they wanted. And then one other thing that ties in with that is if you look at the bottom of the page, given under my hand and seal in the city of such and such on the such and such day of such and such 19, I don't know why they thought that the 1979 prayer book would not still be in use 21 years later, but here we are. It actually, come to think of it, that's actually an interesting point to make, which I didn't write this down, but the reality was there could well have been a thought that it would not be in use 21 years later, because one of the first things that happened after the liturgical movement prayer books and supplements and alternative books of the 1960s and 70s were published is people immediately started work on a second generation of revision to try and modify the language more, to add other new services and all this kind of stuff. It's really that no one had a mind for it afterwards because everyone hated the changes so much. Like it was not well universally received. There was such a struggle that no one had a taste for further large-scale revision, and the church didn't have the money to pay for it to be done properly. It is today one of the reasons why the 1979 prayer book will probably remain in use within the Episcopal Church for decades to come, because they simply can't afford to do proper prayer book revision anymore. When you think about the amount of money that was spent on doing this and the quality of the people involved in it, even you've heard me complain so much about all the editors in there and all that, but at the least, they were trained liturgists and they involved in the formulation of the texts, skilled authors, poets, and so on in the revision of these texts. With the hymnal as well, many, many well-known composers and musicians were involved in the compilation of the 1982 hymnal and in the arrangements that were created for it. The technical skill to do that today simply does not exist within the Episcopal Church. So it's likely that this will remain in use a lot longer than was originally envisioned by the folks that were involved in its creation. Anyway, funny little point. But the last part there, day of 19 blank, and in the blank year of my consecration, I wanted to highlight that part because what does that mean? It means if Bishop Justin were signing this today, he'd say, in the second year of my consecration. This might remind us of historic documents where they were dated by the regnal year of the monarch of the country. So in the second year of the reign of Henry VIII, this law was passed. Or in the 14th year of the reign of the King Emperor of China, whatever. That kind of stuff was historically how these were recorded. And because bishops were considered prelates, princes of the church, there was a similar style to this because all of the governance of the church related to the same structures of how civil society was governed. But again, it's an interesting point here that this has nothing to do with the laity in terms of the authority being granted to this person. It doesn't really talk anywhere in here apart from a reference to it in the second paragraph where it says, in accordance with the canons, you have been selected to serve God in this place. That's the only reference to the involvement of the local congregation. Everything else is, I am granting you authority to do this.
Does they also, in the time of Jesus, some of those refer to how many, I don't remember if it talks about how many years, but it talks about the reign of some.
Yes, absolutely. That was still done in biblical times as well. This is the way, because the reality was, prior to Christianity, there was no form of universal dating. What do we date things from? Well, locally, we date it from the reign of the new king or whoever's in charge in this area. And if you're in England, you're not going to date things based on how long the King of France has been reigning. You're going to base it on the King of England. And if you're in France, you're not going to base it on the Emperor of Germany or even the Pope or something like that, though the Vatican does, or historically did, a little bit of that at one point for certain documents, though of course within the life of the church, just dating it off the life of Christ was fine. But you actually will find that in certain Vatican documents that they dated it off the reign of the Pope because it emphasized the secular and religious authority of the Pope to do so. Anyway, but this is just an interesting thing. I have a copy of basically this exact letter somewhere in my office. It's on my shelf, I think, framed. But the point is that is a rubric expressing the letter that will be referenced in the service itself. Turning the page to the section on concerning the service, there is some interesting stuff in here as well. Oh, yeah, sure. Okay.
Is it sent directly to the priest and then the bishop is notified? Is it sent to the bishop and then the bishop notifies the priest? How does all that?
Good question. This is just a practical question about calling clergy. How does that work? Does it go directly from the congregation to the clergy, or does it go through the diocese? It does generally go directly from the clergy. However, the diocese is going to be involved because, for instance, St. Thomas could go off and call me up in Canada and say, hey, we want you to come down here and be our rector. And I say, sure. And I move on down and you pay to move me down here. And then I show up at the door and then you call the bishop and say, hey, the new priest we called is here. Why don't you come license him? And the bishop says, well, what? No. What are you going to do? I'm not allowed to function without the bishop's license. So it's a cooperative effort. And so in practical terms, the diocese is brought alongside. The diocese, their influence can be more limited if the parish has a strong sense of what they're already looking for. It may be that the diocese will ask the parish to consider certain candidates. For instance, when we have people who've been raised up in our diocese and are looking for a place to go, or with the Diocese of Central Florida, we have what's called our residency program, where people have basically paid apprenticeships as priests for up to 3 years, and usually around the 2-year mark, sometimes even the 1.5-year mark, they'll start looking for openings, and quite often the diocese will recommend them to parishes simply to allow people who we know are good qualified candidates to get on the radar of those parishes. Part of the reality within the Episcopal Church today is there are searches that fail. A parish will list their profile, put it out there, and no one will apply, or the only people that apply are entirely unsuited to the parish, and the search committee rejects them all. And that's a failed search. In the Diocese of Central Florida, that has not happened within several years. Never. We get plenty of applicants, and we can weed them out, the ones that are not worthwhile, and then provide qualified applicants for the search committee to review and consider. And then it comes down to search committee being able to decide between multiple qualified candidates instead of a search committee being required to pick the least worst candidate or something like that. So that's actually really valuable, because think about this. How many clergy do the laity of this parish really know well outside of this parish? Not many. Because you don't really have too much occasion to interact with them. And even those you do, they're not necessarily looking to move, because most likely they're the clergy who are rectors already at nearby parishes. So what interest would they have in leaving their current congregation to go a few miles away to the next door neighbor? That'd be a little awkward. Like if I went to St. Edward's, not only would that tick people off here, but it would just be weird because I'd see you guys all the time. And so that would not be, it would not be a good way of doing business. Plus, all the people here would be mad at all the people over at St. Edward's for poaching their priest. Like, no one would ever do that. So, yeah. Well, but even then it would be, I don't think a right-minded cleric would want to move from one parish to the neighboring parish, simply because they're in such, like at least not with us in St. Edward's, we're like 10 miles apart or less. Such close proximity, so many people living in overlapping jurisdictions, it just doesn't make sense, because it would hamper your pastoral relationship with your parish. So that's it. You're not supposed to do, yeah. Well, but no one would do that, because everyone would hate me for having left to go to St. Edward's, which I'm not going to do, by the way, just to be clear.
Is it only with missions, or can the bishop step in? The only time I've ever been on a search committee, and we had started looking, I hadn't interviewed, but I took somebody, they had talked to somebody, and then the bishop comes along and says, I think you really ought to look at this person, which kind of killed the whole search committee idea. Can that happen with the parish, or is that
Yep.
just a mission
No.
thing?
So, good question. There is a distinction between missions and full-fledged parishes, whether they are assisted or aided parishes or parishes. A parish has a vestry that can form a search committee and call a priest. A mission gets the priest that the bishop chooses, though the bishop generally would still consult with the congregation of the mission. With a regular parish, the bishop could still be more involved, but canonically the parish has the right to call whom they will, and actually there has to be a vote of the vestry to call the person. Even the bishop says, this is who I want you to take, the vestry still has to vote for it, and if the vestry says no, it's not going to happen, because the bishop can't license them. Why? Because the letter required to be used to license them says that they've been selected in accordance with the canons of the church. If they haven't been selected in accordance with the canons of the church, the bishop is committing a crime by licensing them. It's a canonical offense under Title IV for the bishop to do that. So, that said, the vestry of a full parish of St. Thomas could ask the bishop, we'd like you to provide us with a candidate or a list of candidates, which would be a wise thing to do. Because again, getting back to it, if I were struck down dead, you guys wouldn't know who in this diocese is in a search process. You wouldn't know who might be a good fit here. So what are you going to do? Are you just going to create a profile and put it on the parish website and hope for the best? No, you're going to consult with the diocesan office and ask for advice on an interim priest. You're going to ask for advice on candidates for the search. You're going to ask about what clergy in the diocese currently are in a search process, all that kind of stuff. There's another option, sometimes called the English model, where you request that the bishop choose 3 candidates. This is generally how it's done. And of those 3 candidates, the search committee, that's all you consider, is 3 people. And you pick one of them, and one of them will become the priest in charge for a period of 3 years. At the end of the 3-year period, the vestry and the priest will get together and decide whether or not the person will be called to be the rector. It's one way to avoid a longer interim and a longer search process. Particularly, that can be helpful for parishes under certain circumstances where things are going well and there's not a considered need for a significant transition period. Or sometimes it can even work well when there has been a very long-term priest there before. Because quite often, if you've had a beloved priest there for 25 years, the next person that comes in is likely to not last very long. And one of the benefits of this is that it allows that person to not have tenure, and there's a lot less animosity if they choose to not continue on after a few years, versus we spent all this time and effort calling a new rector, and then you decide to quit 3 years in. So that's one of the options. But again, that's at the request or with the consent of the parish to do that. The bishop can advise on the search process, but canonically the parish has to choose. Or rather, the search committee and fundamentally the vestry have to choose. Okay.
How did the whole interim priest, was not familiar with it until I came to St. Thomas.
Interims have been around for ages because in an era where you don't have an assistant in the parish who can just kind of manage things during the vacancy of the rector, you need to have someone there providing sacramental services for the church. Well, and you can get that, but in the 1960s, particularly as this phenomena increased and also as sort of managerial structural theories developed, it was felt that having someone come in intentionally as a short-term transitional measure could be helpful, and it can be, because for instance, Canon Ernie here did a lot of very good work with no intention of ever staying on, and he was able to do it in a way that was far more effective than would have been for me if I had come in without him having done anything and I would have had to take it all on. It would have sapped a lot of my time and energy for the first few years of my ministry. It would have taken longer, and I would have had a lot less time and energy to focus on actual pastoral care and development of the parish, as opposed to having him take care of a few things. So interims can be very helpful, but there are plenty of times where a parish might say, we feel like things are going well and we don't need an interim. We feel like we can handle supply priests for a few months and then go straight into an immediate search process because we already basically have a profile ready and we know what we're looking for already, whatever. Maybe it's because the rector was reaching mandatory retirement and it was known well ahead of time. And the search process effectively began before the rector left by starting with surveys and so on and so forth. The rector becomes their own sort of interim. So there's lots of different reasons why one or the other may be used. It's not mandatory, but it is suggested because part of it is that if you've got just a supply priest coming in, A supply priest is there maybe 1 or 2 days a week and does not provide sufficient pastoral care. They're basically mass factories. They're there to celebrate the mass and preach on Sundays and maybe a weekday mass as well, and a little bit of administrative work on that day to coordinate with the volunteers or staff in the office to make sure everything's organized for Sunday. That's what they do. An interim should be here doing actual pastoral work and leading the parish. So there is a significant difference between them, and if a parish can afford it, an interim is going to be much better. And since you were paying for a priest before, you should at least strive to go for an interim immediately. And then if there are financial considerations later, that's one thing. But if you can't afford an interim, how can you afford a rector? So why would you shoot yourself in the foot and not have a priest there? Because people might leave. You may lose opportunities. You may turn away new guests who are coming in who are like, oh, this place seems weird. There's not a proper priest here. I've come three Sundays and there's different people every single time. What's going on? I don't know if this is the place I want to be. So there are a lot of different reasons why you might enter into that type of arrangement. Let's keep going. So the first paragraph there starts off by saying that the service is primarily for someone being instituted and inducted as the rector of a parish, but may also be used for the installation of deans and canons of cathedrals or the inauguration of other ministries, diocesan or parochial, including vicars of missions and assistant ministers. Alterations to the service should be made in those circumstances. This is an interesting one because, again, historically, this was only about rectors and then cathedral, rectors and equivalents. So cathedral, deans, and then there was a slightly different form of it, but basically the same thing for the collation of archdeacons, and sometimes you might have it for cathedral canons, but quite honestly, in most places, the cathedral chapter handles that, not the bishop directly. The cathedral is its own institution, and the chapter is not the same thing as a vestry. In this diocese, for some reason, I just found out that they just called the vestry of the cathedral the chapter, but that's not what it's supposed to be. The chapter is all the canons of the cathedral. I don't know, it's strange. We do things a little differently here. I don't quite understand why. But all those services, even though they had slightly different names, it was all the same point, is someone being given authority to fill a particular office by the bishop, whether at the cathedral, in a parish, in a mission. There was no distinction between rectors of parishes and vicars. In the UK, it meant something different. It's just here, they specify that here because it's the formal canonical distinction between someone who's in charge of a parish or aided parish versus someone who is in charge of a mission parish. But what you would not use it for is deacons, assistant priests at a parish, or whatever their title was. You can call them the vice rector or the associate rector. Doesn't matter. It could be the assisting priest for families and catechesis or something like that. You still wouldn't use it for that. It doesn't matter what their title was, because they were being called by the rector, and their authority was delegated from the rector, not from the bishop. So it says that here. So this, I'm pointing out, this is a change. Before the 1979 prayer book, this never would have been done. The point is, one of the modifications that you'd make when this comes with someone who's doing some other ministry is they wouldn't get the letter of institution of a minister because they're not being licensed by the bishop to function in that way. You would at the very least omit where is it? Oh no, I guess they just edited it. That's right. They edited the letter. So you could possibly do it because it's the same as licensing. In most other places, you'd have something different. You'd have two documents. One is your license to function as a priest, and one is your letter of induction in the parish. But here they kind of combined it. But if you were, say, if I was an assistant priest at St. James and I got poached, or say, then Tom retires And I dutifully tender my resignation when the new rector arrives, and then Mark says, hey, I want to hire an assistant. Why don't you come over and work for me? I could just go do that. I don't need the bishop to come and do anything about it because I'm already licensed here. In fact, if I were licensed in another diocese, I could still do that. You don't need to be licensed in the diocese that you're serving in. You just need to be licensed in the Episcopal Church, or in the communion, actually, to be called as an assistant, because it's the rector that's doing so, and your ministry functions under their authority, not under the bishop's authority directly. It's obviously it comes from the same, because their authority comes from the bishop, so it's still under the bishop, but you're not licensed in the same way. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyway, the point is here that they wanted to just make this so that you could still at least recognize those things happening. One of the things that's happened in our diocese recently is that they've even started doing this for deacons. So, for instance, when Deacon Dan over at St. Edward's was ordained, they did a celebration of new ministry at the end of his ordination, which was interesting. Never seen that done. Well, I've seen it done once before at Colleen Rothrock's ordination like 2 weeks before. But the point being, that's new and different, but entirely within the rubrics of the prayer book. They intended it to be used that way. And indeed, there's specifically in the rubrics later on saying, if you're doing this celebration of new ministry for a deacon, they should do this. So it's very much intended that it be used that way. The bishop normally performs the service. However, traditionally, other priests would tend to be involved in this. In larger dioceses, the bishop couldn't do it. One of the problems we have in our diocese is that half of these celebrations of new ministry take place on a Sunday when none of the clergy can show up. And it's because the bishop is combining it as his official visitation of the parish. And how do you do that? You do it on a Sunday, because people want the bishop to be there. And so quite often in our diocese, you'll get a celebration of new ministry with confirmations and potentially baptisms. And it's all fine and good, but historically the way that you would handle that is that someone authorized by the bishop would be delegated to perform the service. The bishop would still sign the letter. Like if the bishop asked me to do an installation service or a celebration of new ministry for someone, I would read the bishop's letter to them, and then speaking on behalf of the bishop would go through the celebration of new ministry, acknowledging what the bishop has done, what the congregation has done in calling the priest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and be acting on behalf of the bishop. Historically, again, that was done with the territorial archdeacons doing that because it was simply too hard for a bishop. If a bishop had 100+ parishes, it's kind of hard to do those celebrations of new ministry all the time, especially if people are moving around. So that's part of the reason why that is there, but I have not seen that done in the United States, though there have been conversations about restoring that practice. So, yes.
Are you saying this can be done as part of the Sunday morning service? Because I remember Dan's was done later in the day.
Dan's ordination was done later in the day, yeah. And the celebration of new ministry was a part of it. But, for instance, the last 2 celebrations of new ministry that took place for rectors were on a Sunday morning at their regular time. So one of them, when I was away, I went to one at St. John's, Melbourne, for Father Tim Rutherford. And last Sunday they had one at All Saints Enterprise for Father Stephen Feibelman to be installed as the rector there. And in both of those cases, very few clergy showed up. Why? Because we can't. We've got things to do on Sunday mornings. So it's this constant struggle of how are we going to manage this? And so one of the conversations is maybe it should become more normative to have a delegate of the bishop do the celebration of ministry so that it can take place at an alternate time when at least the clergy of the deanery could show up to show their collegiality. Because you'll read in the rubrics here, it has all these parts where it's talking about, as a sign of collegiality, all the clergy should be involved. Well, it's kind of hard to do when no other clergy show up. It loses the symbolism if only 2 clergy show up, or you just get like 2 retired priests or something like that. It's much nicer when you can do a celebration of new ministry in the evening and have a significant number of clergy show up. I think when we did mine here, it was in the evening on a Saturday, I'm pretty sure, Friday or Saturday evening. Oh, maybe, I don't know. It was the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels. I don't remember what day it was, what day of the week it was. Point was, it was in the evening, and we had, I think, about a dozen clergy show up from around the diocese. So that's good. It's valuable to have that opportunity for other clergy to be present. In addition to all of the people of the church coming, because it also reminds the people, again, this is a part of something bigger than just this parish. We're not a congregational polity. It's not just us and our pastor in our parish, in our church. We're a part of something bigger. So it's an important message to give. Most of these other rubrics are interesting. There's a note in there about concelebration, other ministers being invited to participate by concelebrating. This almost never happens, though Hatchett argues that this is when there's a deputy presiding. So again, if I were asked as the deanery dean to preside at a celebration of new ministry in this deanery, then the idea would be that all the other clergy of the deanery would concelebrate with the newly installed rector and all the rest of us doing it, which is an interesting idea. And also, I'm pretty sure there's a note in here that when a delegate is doing the celebration new ministry, the rector is the principal celebrant at the Eucharist once you transition to the altar. Yeah, there we are. So the idea being, you come in as a deputy of the bishop, you start the celebration new ministry, and then as a college of clergy, you go up to the altar and celebrate together. Interesting idea, but never seen it done. Also, I don't really much care theologically for concelebration. I think it's weird, but neither here nor there. Ministers of other churches may appropriately be invited to participate. Most commonly, this would be inviting someone to preach. There are a number of notes in there later on about who can preach and all the rest of that. And that might be that when you've got someone who converted or you've got a longtime friend in another tradition, you can ask that they be invited to preach, and that is permissible. This is one of the few times when the person involved has a real say over who is going to preach, because at your ordination, the bishop will preach. But at your celebration in your ministry, you could ask a friend from school, you could ask any other appropriate person, and they could be authorized to do so. This is the other interesting part here. The new minister, if a deacon, should read the gospel, prepare the elements of the offertory, and assist at the celebration of the altar and dismiss the congregation. One of the funny parts about doing celebrations of new ministry for deacons at their ordination is that at the time when half of these things happen, they're not deacons yet, so they can't do it. So it's just one of those funny little things, but I guess it's a nice thing to do, with one little historical note that's a bit puzzling. Remember what we said at the very beginning? This developed after people were being ordained in places where they weren't going to serve in their formal leadership role, because before that, it was considered sufficient to just have the ordination take place there. If you're a deacon being ordained in your own parish, why do you need to have a celebration new ministry in addition to simply doing the ordination? If you're being ordained at the cathedral with 7 other deacons, you don't get a celebration new ministry there or in your parish, where it might actually be appropriate to do a celebration new ministry, particularly if you've got a significant number of members in the congregation who aren't able to attend the ordination. Thinking about people who may not want to travel all the way from Port St. Lucie or Ocala to get to the cathedral on a Sunday evening or whenever the ordination might be taking place, and then getting home at 10 o'clock at night or something. That would make a little bit more sense, but right now that's not the way we're doing it, so who knows. Okay. And then that last rubric there is if it's a lay person being instituted in some kind of a role. it's appropriate for them to function as is appropriate in the liturgy for a layperson. They actually could do it because they're still a layperson no matter when you do this. So.
How can a layperson be an institute? Because I don't remember anything up there in that first paragraph that would be a layperson.
It doesn't mention it there, but it can be adjusted for anyone. I've never seen it used for that because, again, that's an innovation of the 1979 prayer book. I think the idea would be perhaps if you're taking the consecrated life, this might be a way of acknowledging that if you're going to serve in the parish. So if you're taking religious vows, like joining a religious order, where you're going to stay in the parish instead of going to an abbey or a nunnery or a convent or a monastery or something like that. If you're staying in the parish but serving in the consecrated religious life, a celebration of new ministry might be more appropriate than the other service that we talked about before, because it's a chance to celebrate rather than just do the vows and consecration for service. It could be that you might do a celebration of new ministry for a lay reader that's been licensed to lead in a parish, because that is a new ministry, and they're taking a role of liturgical leadership in a parish that doesn't have a priest. So there are options for that. That's probably where it would mostly get used, but that's not common here because I think I can think of only one parish right now where we have lay leaders running the parish that way. And I can't remember which one it is. But I think we only have the one. So it's just not as common in this particular diocese, but certainly in other dioceses, and I imagine quite so in missionary dioceses. That might be more common. Yep. Okay. We'll come back to the additional directions towards the end. Let's go on with the actual service. There are some interesting notes here about how this has changed relative to the older services. Let's see. It does sort of begin with its ancient, well, okay, obviously first off, you can still have a hymn come in. You can process in, and then the service begins immediately with the institution. Notice it's, in a sense, a little bit different than the standard in that we're not doing the normal beginning to the service and then having all the unusual stuff happening after the sermon. We're actually having the institution happening at the beginning. This is retaining the more familiar structure of the older style services. If you look at a 1928 prayer book or any of the American prayer books prior to 1979 or any of the older British prayer books, you'll see this closer to this structure, though it's still different. The service begins with a declaration of why we're gathering from the bishop or the representative. Interestingly enough, the wardens start off here, and this kind of inverses things around. Historically, it wouldn't be the wardens doing this, but it's the wardens who are making the declaration. Sorry, I misspoke before. I said the bishop or the deputy. I meant to say it's the wardens that do this part. Historically, it would have been the other way around, but in the 1979, it changes it around. The reason that's fascinating is because remember all the points where we're emphasizing the bishop's authority, and that this is an action of the bishop to do this and not something of the congregation. But here, in a sense, the bishop becomes the functionary because the wardens come before the bishop to say that we've chosen so-and-so to be the rector of the church, and they're well qualified. And then the bishop responds to that, not by granting assent, but by saying what he's already done in response to that of, I already signed this letter. Then, rather than giving a real charge to the person, the person just responds to the bishop's question, so-and-so, do you, in the presence of this congregation, commit yourself to this new trust and responsibility? Historically, they would be asked to read aloud the oaths and subscriptions that they've made, so their oath of canonical obedience, their subscription to the doctrines of the church, things like that, where they're declaring their willingness to serve in this place in conformity to the rules and the authority that's been granted to them. Now they just say it in terms of, I'm committing myself to the trust and responsibility of this office. an interesting way of phrasing it. Also interesting is the next thing that happens. Will you who witness this new beginning support and uphold so-and-so in this ministry? And the people must respond, we will. You're not given a choice. What this replaced was granting the people the opportunity to object to the installation. This is one of those strange things where there doesn't seem to be a lot of coherence to the beginning of this order of service, where the changes seem to show a tension between two different redactors, one of whom is trying to emphasize the authority of the parish, and the other who's trying to emphasize the authority of the bishop. And it just comes out as a little bit odd, to be quite honest. There could be some more coherence to it, but I couldn't find any explanation for why these changes in particular were made. Anyway, after that, we continue on with the litany for ordinations, which is commended for use here, though any litany could be used, and there are, of course, liturgical supplements that could be used. You could use the Great Litany if you preferred. Historically, the litany, it was just called the litany, but the Great Litany was used, and the litany for ordinations was just one optional petition inserted in the litany that referred to those about to be ordained. So you wouldn't insert that in here because the person isn't about to be ordained, they've already been ordained, so you just use the regular form of the litany. Let's see here. Following the litany, you get the Liturgy of the Word. So again, the person, this is in a sense similar to baptisms and ordinations, where part of the service does actually begin at the beginning there. There's an examination of the person and some kind of assent to what's going to happen. Then you go into the reading of the word, and then you have the induction afterwards. Or like a marriage service where you start off and say a few things, then you have the liturgy of the word and the sermon, and then you come back off and finish it all off. It's kind of the same idea here. However, there's one rather unique feature here. If you read at the bottom of 560, after the sermon and any response to it, the congregation sings a hymn. What? In the additional directions, let me find the rubric there. Whoever the person being inducted wants to, pretty much. It's generally speaking their choice within reason. So that would be an opportunity where if I've got a no, they wouldn't give their own. But say at mine, if I had requested, I could have asked for like a Roman Catholic friend to give the sermon, or a lay person who is qualified to preach could give it, or someone from some other Christian tradition could do it. You wouldn't ask someone of another religious faith to do it. That would be weird, which I'm sure has happened in the Episcopal Church because we're weirdos. But generally that would be an opportunity for a minister of another tradition to serve. It would be appropriate. I've seen that happen once or twice. I'm trying to remember. And it was generally like sort of non-denominational types getting invited in from clergy who used to be non-denominational, and so they were bringing in their old pals to encourage and celebrate them in their new ministry they were entering into. It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, they just wouldn't normally. It'd be weird. It'd be weird. Yeah, they can, but the some other person is more important. So in that one, in that paragraph, it's the fourth paragraph from the bottom, representatives of the congregation or of the community, the bishop or other persons present, may speak in response to the address or sermon. Don't know. The address it talks about is instead of preaching a sermon, you can kind of give a little talk about what the ministry is instead. It's meant to be very broad. These are very permissive rubrics. I couldn't find any documentation about what exactly was anticipated by that. I don't know why you wouldn't just proclaim the gospel and incorporate the ministry into the proclamation of the gospel, but I don't know. I'm saying before the whole internet, I'm really not sure what that's all about, but I thought it was fascinating that there could be a response, and possibly the thought about the response was if the bishop makes a response, sometimes when you have someone else come up and give some kind of an address, you might have someone else then come up and give a theological reflection on what they said. So that may be a part of it, but I don't know what else, because this is an innovation unique to this. You don't get responses in previous prayer books. Someone preaches and that's it. Wardens are vestry members, yeah. The senior warden is appointed by the rector and is ex officio a member, or sorry, no, that's not true. The rector appoints one member of the vestry to be the senior warden, and the vestry elects another member to be the junior warden, but they are already elected members of the vestry, yeah.
And that varies from diocese to diocese.
Yeah, because that's controlled by diocesan canon, but in this diocese, yeah. Yeah, and in other places, they don't use the term junior and senior. They would use the terms rector's warden and people's warden, because it's reflective of who gets to appoint them. Yeah, I know. I don't understand why they don't do that, but oh well. Let's see here. The hymn that follows really is just to allow time for things to happen in preparation for the induction, because you may need to move the faldstool out, you may need to get all of your people up here ready to give their symbols of office and all this kind of stuff. All the rest of that, it's really an opportunity to have covering music to let everyone get in place and get organized, rather than just having like a 2-minute pause after the sermon while everyone kind of gets in order and you're like, okay, you first, now then you, because there's 10 people coming up here to give gifts. Just notably historically, the bishop, how did it work? The senior warden came and gave the new rector keys to the parish, then as a sign of their authority to take control of the property. Then the bishop would give a prayer book, a Bible, and the canons of the church to the new rector. So that is to say, I'm giving you the authority to proclaim the gospel in this place, to lead the liturgical worship of this place, and to do so in conformity to the canons of this place. It's permissive and also restrictive at the same time. In the new form, they developed all these new symbols. This is unique, or it's a new development, I should say, not unique. It's a new development to have these symbols. There is a note there that it says that whatever symbols you use should be large enough that people can see what they are. I think the idea of having fewer gifts actually makes a little bit more sense. It's nice to include more people coming up, but the real problem is that when you've got a dozen things like that, either the person is collecting all these dozens of items and holding on to them and it's not becoming, it becomes farcical as they struggle to hold them, or they're receiving these things and immediately handing them off, and you lose the sense of receiving a gift. Because it's not a gift. It's like, oh yeah, here's one of the prayer books I grabbed from the pew. Don't forget to give it back when you're done so I can put it back in the pew. Things like that. So that's one of the things where I understand the idea behind it. However, I'm not 100% sure it all works. And also, the one that bugs me the most is the bishop, the second gift there. The bishop presents a vessel of water saying, so-and-so, take this water and help me, or if it's a delegate, help the bishop. Baptize in obedience to our Lord. 99% of the time, they give you an empty ewer. It's the ewer that they would hold water in when you're doing a baptism, but it's empty. And it's like, okay, so it's actually a symbol of a sign of a sacrament. I think that's silly. I think the reason that's there, of course, is because of the emphasis on baptism. They want to make sure that they're referring to baptism here because it's meant to be the chief sacrament in the 1979 prayer book. But again, I would think that judicious limitation of these symbols and thoughtfulness about what we're doing might be more appropriate in creating more meaningful symbolism of we're actually giving you something, we're giving you a gift. Well, I think when we did it here, we had people line up over there. I stood here, and I think Ken and Scott stood next to me, and they would hand me things, and I would hand them off, and the only thing that I got to keep out of all the gifts that I got was a key ring. Didn't even get to keep the key that was on it. Well, no, I think it was a real key, but I think it was Leon's key or Diane's key, and I had my own. Like, it was silly. But anyway, I do still have the key ring, and it's got my name on it. It says St. Thomas Episcopal, or it says St. Thomas Rector, and the other side says Father Matthew Pro 2021. So I still keep that. That is a meaningful gift to me, which I have on my person at all times. But the other things, again, it was, a prayer book from the pews, a Bible from the pews, a stole that either was already mine or that was one of the parishes that I don't wear. It was, yeah, the basket. Okay. Anyway, or it could be like the bishop with his sheep. Anyway, yeah. So you are remembering that correctly. If you're,
we don't have it for people in West Virginia, but St. Matthew's in New Zealand is one for large. And I've seen these gifts being done, and obviously they weren't being done for the church in which they were going to serve.
so not all of these things would be done there, but gifts appropriate to the office of the person being ordained are supposed to be given. In the 1979 prayer book, if you remember from our lessons on this, the 1979 prayer book flattens it all out and just gives everyone a Bible. But historically, a deacon would receive a copy of the New Testament, a priest would receive a copy of the Bible, and a chalice and paten as a sign of their ministry of word and sacrament. The deacon received the New Testament as a sign of their charge to proclaim the gospel of Christ. I forget what bishops get. I guess they just get their episcopal regalia, their ring and their crozier. Well, you're vested according to your order at an ordination. So yeah, you do get a stole and potentially a dalmatic or chasuble as well, depending on what the style of the vesting is. But that's a little bit different because there's no words going along with it. You're not getting it saying, receive these vestments as this, what is the stole? Well, Dan had a celebration in ministry happen at his ordination. So
I've seen these things happen, and that's the only instance.
yeah, well, it's new. They just started doing the celebrations of new ministry at diaconal ordinations recently. They don't do it for priestly ordinations. Those ones are still kept separate so far as I understand it, though we'll find out because I think there's a priestly ordination happening, and it shouldn't involve a celebration of new ministry because the person's being ordained in a church other than where they're going to serve, I think. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Let's see here. Let's keep going. How are we doing time-wise? Almost 4 o'clock. Yeah. Well, we're almost done, so we're humming along. We're doing great. Let's see here. The prayer of self-dedication at the bottom of 562 is then said. This is a beautiful prayer. This was composed in 1799 in the United States, so it's unique. It's not unique to the 1979 prayer book, 1799. All the American prayer books after 1789 had this in it. But it's a lovely, lovely prayer, and I think you can see it from reading it. It's obviously been touched up, but you can see the depth of theology in it, which you don't always get in some of the more modern compositions for various reasons. So it's lovely that it was kept, and also that the the new minister, note only if it's a priest is to say this, because this is historic and was only used for priests and was composed for a priest being installed as a rector or a dean of a cathedral. or equivalent. But it requires that they kneel in the midst of the church to say this as a sign both of humility before God and also before the congregation. And it goes back to some of the parts of the ordination service that are missing, where the bishop talks about how weighty an office to which you have been called. So I really appreciate that that's there. I think, to me, that was the most memorable part of my installation, and certainly a beautiful prayer. The ministers then presented to the congregation, who can either then clap or somehow otherwise greet them. It says applause is appropriate. There's a rubric. It's permissible, not required. I don't know, hootin' and hollerin' is maybe appropriate in the South. It's culturally appropriate. Yeah, Tom would hoot and holler. Yeah, there we are. Then that's pretty much it. The service then basically, or actually, interestingly enough, the bishop invites the new minister to bid the peace, similar to how at ordinations the bishop bids the new minister to give the blessing at the end, the new priest to give the blessing at the end rather than doing it himself, even though he's the bishop. The Eucharist is intended to follow. Historically, the Eucharist was only started to be permissible in the 1928 prayer book. Prior to that, a service of installation would follow morning or evening prayer. And so it actually does dramatically change the style of service, because it used to be a more festive celebration when you would gather for a choral evensong followed by the installation of the rector, versus now where it can kind of feel like it's a little bit more of the usual. I don't know, that's been my experience with it, because one of the fun things about Canada was they didn't do a proper service of celebration of new ministry in the Book of Alternative Services. So everyone still uses the traditional installation service from the 1962 Book of Common Prayer, which is much more closely related to the 1928. So I've done multiple services of celebration of new ministry, its equivalent, where it was done after a choral evensong, and it was just a lot of fun. So beautiful service at the cathedral when we were collating an archdeacon. Let's see here. The additional directions section is primarily, or after communion, it's got the post-communion prayer from ordinations is used, but then the bishop asks them to pronounce the blessing again, and if the deacon, a deacon or a priest, if no deacon is present, dismisses the assembly. So that's the same thing, although, again, the priest would do it rather than the bishop. Because normally you would have the officiant or the celebrant do it, but here it kind of emphasizes the new minister doing it. The additional directions really just give you directions on how to adjust things based on circumstances. Clarifying how you're going to adjust things and change things depending on what exactly is going on. How to find appropriate readings, all the rest of that. The symbols, it notes, should be large enough to be visible to all and should remain in the sight of the congregation during the induction. The vestments and bread and wine may be used in the Eucharist, which follows. That's kind of an interesting one, because they don't have you present the proper vestments, because they just have you give a stole. So is the priest supposed to take off the stole that they're already wearing, put on the new one, and then hopefully have a matching chasuble to go with it? Or like, I don't understand some of the things there, though I think it is appropriate that they mention that the symbols should be large enough to be visible. The whole point is that people be able to see them. The problem is, again, 99% of the time, people just grab a regular pew prayer book, and it's not necessarily identifiable as a prayer book, other than if you know exactly what it is already, but it's not clear everything that's going on. Or when they receive this oil stock and be among us as a healer, little thing like that. Like, I love the idea of it. I think in practice it doesn't work very well. No, a priest can bless the oil of healing. The bishop has to consecrate the oil of chrism. But it's, yeah. Well, they're not presenting it as if they consecrated or blessed it. They're presenting it to say, we need you to use this for us.
What's the difference between the two things?
What it's used for. Oil of the infirm is used for healing, anointing for healing. Chrism is used at confirmations, baptisms, and ordinations.
And so the one that some priests put in their, have like a ring that they.
Yeah, I don't have it in my pocket. It's in my office.
That's the oil of healing.
That's yeah, if it says OI or OH or H, that's healing. Oil of the infirm. The OI is not actually oil of the infirm. That's just a neat idea someone came up with. It's actually the Latin oleum infirmum. But yeah. Okay. Conclusions, and then we can take a few more questions because we're only like 6 minutes over. I tried. The celebration of new ministry maintains an historic continuity with the services that came before it, providing, and I say the services that came before it because it was generally called induction and installation of a minister or something like that. But it maintains continuity through its use of a liturgical ceremonial celebration of the authority being conferred on that person to minister in a particular way and in a particular place. The 1979 prayer book has this odd pattern of seeming to try to shift around the emphasis more towards the power of the laity and parish away from the bishop, and then at the same time, right after that, being almost clericalist. So it's interesting because generally speaking, this is the first time where I've really pointed that out to you, and we're on page 560. And that's the first time where that's really been noticeable. And so my speculation is that there were some competing visions for how this service ought to occur, and it didn't quite get properly ironed out during the revision process, that this is some kind of compromise. I could be wrong. I'm sure that someone more learned than I will tell me, you're an idiot. This is what it's all about. And that's fine, but that's what it looks like. So take that with a grain of salt, but that's my conclusion. And then lastly, this does remain a very important service in the life of congregations because it is an opportunity to celebrate important things and to have these festive moments. There's a reason we talk about, in cultural terms, we talk about life stages and milestones in life and marking those moments. And having a significant new ministry start up in a parish and celebrating it is a milestone in the life of the parish. It should be a time to mark and come together in unity to celebrate that we've got a new priest coming into the parish, both as a sign to the priest that the people welcome and accept your ministry here, but also as a reminder that we are in this together. I think it's appropriate that the people do come up and participate. As much as I've been nagging on the how well the presentation of the gifts works, I think it's important to have the people coming up and doing that because it works in a twofold way. Because the people are sort of welcoming the person and inviting you to exercise that ministry, but they're also inviting you to exercise that ministry. You've been charged to exercise that ministry. You have a responsibility, and so it's important to do it in both those senses. So this is a really important one, despite the fact that most of us probably will only see it, a few times. God willing, not too many times in the life of a parish. And that's all we've got for today. Any final questions before we wrap up?
The fact that it keeps talking about layperson, there's no part of this that could be used as the installation of a vestry, is it?
No. The Book of Occasional Services has I don't remember what it's called, but it's the service for acknowledging the election of vestry members in the church. Yeah, it's got a separate one for that. I guess it's like the blessing of new ministries. So there's a thing for blessing the choir, blessing the vestry, blessing all sorts of new ministries of different sorts. But I don't remember exactly what it's called, but yeah, that's that. So, anything else? Okay, I'm going to turn it off and then I'll make a quick announcement and then we're done. So thank you. Oh, no, I won't. I got myself distracted. Let's pray. As our Savior Christ has taught us, we are bold to say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to go turn this off, and then I'll do the announcement. Gosh. Okay, so